Lisa Vetten is the director of Tshwaranang, which campaigns to end violence against women. She joins us to speak to us about some of the issues that we've just raised. A very good evening, Lisa. Good to talk to you again. Now, just explain to our viewers why DNA backlog prevents victims from getting closure, but most importantly, justice.
Well, the first thing we have to bear in mind is that DNA is only going to be relevant in cases where identity is in dispute. So that will typically be stranger rapes, and in some instances rape as well, where somebody says, no, it wasn't me. In the majority of cases, which roughly in the case of adults, about 60% of cases, rapes occur between people who know each other. And then the dispute is not around identity, it's around consent. You know, the accused saying, yes, she did consent, and the victim saying, no, I didn't consent. So it's a small proportion of cases that are affected by questions of DNA. And DNA is very, very important, as we saw in the Krugersdorp gang rapes, in terms of trying to tie somebody to an attack. You know, very often in a stranger rape, it may happen at night. Somebody may grab you from behind, and you may not see them very well. So eyewitness identification will be out of the question. It won't be very good at all. And DNA is what ties that person to you. DNA also becomes very important because it's a way in which you can tie one rapist to many rapes. And so you can identify a serial rapist who typically doesn't stop until they get caught. So DNA is very, very important from that perspective. But it's by no means the only way in which you can build a case against a stranger rapist. Some stranger rapists, there's not enough DNA, there isn't enough actual DNA that can be extracted from the sample for it to be usable. So you've got to still do things like, if a cell phone is stolen, trace the use of the cell phone records, use your informants. If anything else was stolen, try and track that down through pawn shops or others where you might find stolen goods. You also need to just sometimes do door-to-door from communities to ask if anybody can be identified. So DNA is important, but it can't be the only thing in a case, and it's only going to benefit those cases where there's a stranger rape. When it's delayed, you make those cases.
All right, so we're going to talk about the other aspects as well. It's no problem. We're going to talk about the other aspects as well, Lisa. But I mean, things are pretty relative. The minister says the figure now sits somewhere below 100,000. Now, we've got to look at it against the backdrop of the reported cases, but most importantly, cases that have not even made it to the, you know, the criminal justice record. The Minister of Police blaming the backlog also on the expiration of critical contracts, which he said were in place for, among other things, the procurement of consumables for DNA analysis. If you can talk to us a little bit about this, including these buccal samples that were in shortage.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things we must also bear in mind is that the backlog at the forensic laboratories is a long-standing. I can still remember in the early 2000s working on rape cases then, and there was a backlog then. So the question you always have to ask is, the police manage to catch up and then things fall apart again. And so what is it that they're not doing to make sure that the backlog isn't permanently eradicated? There's been some suggestion they don't have enough laboratories, they need to be opening up more. There were also questions around the fact that one of those contracts may have been entered into corruptly. And so when that person withheld samples and refused to do their work, that's also contributed to the backlog. So there's a range of different factors that go into the backlog. And if they're not all addressed, and if they're not consistently addressed, you know, things like whether or not you have enough people who are employed. So COVID, for instance, had a very direct effect on the backlog because of the number of people who could work in the laboratory at any one time was restricted. So you've got to look at all those factors to understand what was going into the delay and whether or not you're going to have permanently addressed delay or whether we've just caught up temporarily and in fact we haven't caught up completely either before we completely do away with that delay.
I think the question not only from women women and children, you know, society in general who watches in horror the heinous crimes that we read about every single day, especially targeted at women and children. why does mismanagement like this continue? Because the minister spoke about previously the fact that the NFSL electronic registry system, which manages evidence for DNA analysis, was offline. That resulted in a backlog. And he also admits the fact that this backlog does delay the prosecution of hundreds of cases across the country. So this is only now going to be dealt with next year when the catch-up is done. Why does such mismanagement continue?
You know, I think this is the problem with trying to tie a national strategic plan to government. It is an unfortunate fact that I think we all see every day, even in just the state of our roads, that government, during the last 10, 12 years of state capture, the competence has eroded significantly. There is simply no way that you're going to rebuild competence and capacity in government in the space of a year. When you erode and damage something, it takes years to repair. The other thing we also have to take into account is, for example, is that corruption has meant that there is so much less money to be able to employ people. And if we get to the courts, you'll see the real impact there on not having sufficient prosecutors to prosecute sexual offences. So those are deep problems. They are going to take many years to fix, unfortunately. So I think having a plan that depends on government's capacity is one that's going to doom you to disappointment unless you're prepared to sit in and wait those 5 years or so for government to improve. And who knows if that is going to happen.
Lisa, so we're talking about this as we look at the fact that there's an inter-ministerial committee on GBVF. Have they been able to make some notable, palpable headway towards the National Strategic Plan on GBVF, especially as we're just 2 days away from the second presidential summit on this?
I would be hard-pressed to name anything they have actually done to make a difference, to be honest. We've seen the 3 new bills that have now become an act, but for the Domestic Violence Act, we're still waiting for those regulations. But I mean, in other things, we have not seen the kind of difference there should be. For instance, we haven't started talking about the courts. What is deeply concerning is that not only has there been a backlog with DNA, there's also a backlog in the courts. And if you look at the NPA's prosecution and convictions data for rape, for example, you can see a distinct decline. In 2013-14, 18% of all rapes that were reported were resulting in a conviction. By the previous financial year, that had declined to 8%. It had more than halved. It's gone up to about just under 11%, but that's still not good enough, and it's still not where we were in 2013-14. There has been no public discussion of this, and there has been no public outcry. And this is where you are seeing things like the impact of freezing on prosecutors' posts, the delay in DNA, but you're seeing exactly the same problem, that contracts for equipment at the courts, like closed-circuit television, like microphones, as with the DNA equipment, was simply not finalized for a year. So you've got now cases that have been postponed, and because they get postponed so many times, run the risk of being struck off the roll by the prosecutors because you have defense who argue justice delayed is justice denied. Now, what has the Interministerial Committee done about that? Where is the investigation into why that is happening? And that investigation is crucial to understand what needs to be done to fix up this very core element of justice. So for me, we can sit and speak about putting in place brand new law, but if you cannot convict and if you cannot put cases through, there's no point in having that law.
Lisa, I'm sure we will have a chat once this Congress gets underway, and of course the President signing into law amendment bills at the beginning of the year will look at that and if they've had any impact in the fight against GBVF as well. Lisa Vetten, Director of Tshwaranang, which campaigns to end violence against women.